And we're back. Thanks again for joining me in this series. This is the How to Draw HD Remix series. This is the new improved quality version of our previous How to Draw series, so that way we can show you guys the details that go into developing your own character art. And if you've been following along thus far, then you know that one of the things we first covered was research, followed up by thumbnails, then finishing with a tightened line sketch so that we can pull it into Adobe Illustrator and we could do our final line work. Okay, so if you're not familiar with those sections, just go back and check the HD Remix sections that are labeled research, thumbnails, and line sketch. All right, now we're going to talk about inking. This is personally one of my favorite topics, and it happens once you've gotten your tightened line sketch and you bring it into Adobe Illustrator. The first thing you want to do is you go to File, and you want to place your artwork on the actual artboard. So you click Place. Mine is already here, but then once it's placed in, you can move it around, position it how you want, and then what you want to do is you want to lock that layer. But here's a key thing to do before locking that layer. When you want to ink, depending upon how dark your illustration is, it may be difficult to see it. Typically when you ink, and let me just, let me put this up here. Matter of fact, I'm going to put these two together, and I'm going to then drag them here. Okay, when you want to actually ink, typically you're using black ink. So you want to make sure that your fill and your stroke are actually set properly. And I tend to eliminate the fill altogether because you don't need that. I then take the actual stroke and I would start outlining my artwork, basically putting a stroke in every last one of these intricate little details that are on my art piece. Now, go back. And in order to do this, you'll notice, like if I were to start this now, I would create a new layer, label it ink, and that's where I would start drawing. So I already have an ink layer lined up. And what I'm going to do is just start a new one just so you can see. And I'm going to use the pen tool. And once I start drawing with the pen tool, you'll notice that it's easy to see where it's going, but it would be much easier, if I didn't have all this shading in the background. So you might want to lighten up your background image. So you would click and select that image either on the artboard or by your appearances attribute on the actual layers panel, and then go down to opacity, and you can change the opacity with the slider in your transparency panel. Okay? The other way to do this is instead of, let's say, using this, you can double click outside of the name of the layer on the actual layer. It'll bring up your layers option box, and then you can click template. Once you click that, you can move over to your dim images box and you can click OK or change it to a different percentage. And once you do that, you'll notice that it dims your image. Same thing as using the opacity. If you look over in your layers panel, you'll notice that the template icon, and this essentially toggles the visibility in your view mode. But this icon normally is an eye, but because it's not, this shows you that it's actually a template. Okay, so you know that you would be able to click on the template and the layers options, click it off, dim images will disappear, you click OK, and you have your original image back. But again, for me, I like to select the image, and you'll notice the eye icon is back. I go to my transparency panel, and I reduce the opacity how I want, and then I lock that. And now, when I go to my inking layer, and I start to use it, you'll notice it's easier to see what's behind it and where the actual line itself is going. So you want to take that into consideration and be very, very careful as you are developing it. Okay, so let's move forward. You're going to have several options in terms of how you can ink your piece. Now for me, I used the pen tool, and I already have my ink set up on my piece. And the reason I already did this, I used the pen tool. Why did I do that? I love the pen tool. To me, it's the most accurate tool. A lot of people like a tool that's more organic, and you'll find that in your brush and your pencil tools. But me, I like the pen tool, and I feel you can make it more organic as long as you lay it down properly. And then you can start to manipulate your lines. Now, a lot of people like to do as least, I guess, work as possible. So they like to change in terms of the amount of lines that are going to be necessary. And they'll lay down fewer lines, which means they'll do one really long line around the entire piece, and then they'll do smaller sections down until they have to do the intricate little ones. Sometimes you can break it apart and you can do several little ones all together that'll make up your big actual piece. Now that's up to you. It depends on your style of illustration, whether or not that's something you want to do. But for me, that's how I set it up. So no worries if you set it up differently. Now, if I were to turn this off, you'll see. Normally, I would, depending upon the type of artwork, manipulate these lines, and a lot of people in Adobe Illustrator, they love like huge strokes. Okay, so making your line work actually like bigger to them is a huge deal because they feel everything in Adobe Illustrator should be cartoonish. But there is a realist aspect or realism aspect to Adobe Illustrator that if you know how to manipulate it right, you can get your things to look really realistic, or at least more so than the pop comic art or the kitty art, I call it sometimes, the really colorful, playful art that some people will create in Adobe Illustrator. So what you want to do is, let's turn this off, and we can start looking at how we would work with the pen tool. Now the pen tool, you have a few options. You can trace and go around your subject, and I'm just doing this really quickly, but what I essentially would do normally is I would go in really close and I would make sure I'm getting every curve and every detail that I want in my piece, so that way it looks as close to my sketch as possible. The further away you do it, the more you miss little intricate parts to your illustration. Like me doing it this far, you'll notice if I zoom in, I've missed a little space here, and it may not seem like much, but in the end it will once you look at the final line work. So you want to make sure you're as accurate as possible. That's why we say the line sketch that you pull in is the most important part of developing your illustration. Okay, so let's say I get out of this, and I'm going to delete that. I'm going to turn on our previous ink layer because I already created this with the pen tool. And one of the things you can do is you can change, like you saw previously, the actual weight of your actual stroke. Okay. In addition to that, you can also select that stroke and choose different profiles which are set below. And you'll notice that it changes the flow of the actual stroke around the subject. So there are a few things you can do with the pen tool. You can, again, change the weight, change the profile. You can also change how the edges are affected. Pay attention to the spikes. I'm going to change these to rounded edges, and you'll notice now the spikes have a rounded edge as opposed to the pointy edge that they originally had. So we can do that, and you'll notice that everything that was pointy is now rounded. Or we can do an extended, and this will actually miter the ends, which means it clips them off where the tips are themselves. Okay, so that's an option that you have as well. And you can mix and match these, the cap with the actual corner. The corner judges how it actually rounds out. Like this is a mitered corner, and then we have rounded corners. We have your regular corners. All right. Now, if we were to change the cap, there's the butt cap, which actually ends right in the middle of the actual anchor point. We have a rounded cap, which rounds out around the anchor point. And then we have the projecting cap, which shoots out a little bit past the anchor point. And then your limit shows how far you're willing to allow those points to go. If you pay attention to the spikes, you might see it. Let's see if we increase this a bit. And yeah, there we go. You saw one? I think it just happened. Let's see. If we look back by, yep, there it is, by the shoulder blade, you'll notice that this point just shoots out. So you got to be careful with your limit. I know this is extreme right now, this 260, but it's just to show you that this can happen. And it usually happens depending upon how sharp of an angle or turn you make when you are developing the line work itself. So you want to be careful when you're doing that. Now, let's take this back to where it was, and we're not going to leave it there because we don't like this thick line work. We want our line work to be how we have set it. One of the things you can also do is you can work with the width tool. Now the width tool is a very complicated tool, but it allows you to, let's see, it allows you to select points, and then you can change the actual thickness of the line at that point. And I've given tutorials on this as well. If you look at the Learn to Use tutorials, there are tutorials on each of these tools: the brush tool, pencil, the width tool, the pen tool, you name it, there's a tutorial on it if you want to look at the basics. And we're not going to go over every aspect of it, but just know that using the width tool, you can manipulate your stroke at various points, and they each act as anchor points, so it doesn't actually manipulate anything all around. It just does from whatever your last point was that you created something at. Okay, so that's another option you have, and that starts to create a profile for that actual line, something that you want to be very, very wary of. So let's get rid of that. Let's open our sketch back up, and then let's go to our brush tool. All right, and matter of fact, let's go to our Blob Brush tool, and what we're going to do is we're going to click on our ink layer, and we're going to make sure that we start developing this using the Blob Brush. Now we have several options that we can choose from with the Blob Brush. What we can do is we can double click on our Blob Brush, and what will happen is we'll have an options box that comes up, and that allows us to choose between how accurate and how smooth we actually want our brush to be. And we have a slider that basically goes from 0 to 100. It has two intermediate points before the beginning and the end. And how far across you bring it will govern how smooth or how accurate it is. I tend to like accurate, but with a little bit of smoothness, so I tend to go to the first rung unless I'm looking for a perfectly curved. Let's say we're doing things that are like very circular or geometric in shape. Smoothness is perfect for circles, even for ovals. Now, we can change the size of the brush. We can also change the angle of the brush. And we can change the roundness of the brush, whether we want it flat, more oval, or we want it more circular. There are also options that allow you to change these on the fly while you're using it if you have a tablet. And they can go from pressure sensitive, random, fixed, stylus, wheel, your tilt, bearing, and rotation. And you can look those up to figure out what they are, but they're pretty self-explanatory. If you have a tablet and you work with them, you'll see the flexibility of using them. I tend to use pressure based because it will change depending upon how much pressure that I actually put on it. I'm only really concerned, I'm going to turn this off for angle and leave angle at fixed. And matter of fact, I'll leave angle at tilt. And then roundness, we're actually going to leave as fixed because we want it to stay at the roundness that we've created. Now, what we can do is we can click variation, and we can change how it varies depending, like how greatly it varies, depending upon how we actually do this. So if we tilt it more, there'll be more of a variation that goes as we draw our line. If we apply more pressure, there will be more of a size difference if we increase that, or less of a size difference. It just depends on how you want your lines to function. And essentially what you do is you get familiar with these as you're drawing. Now, let's click OK. And we're going to go out here. And you see, this is essentially the thickness of our line if we were to start drawing. And I definitely don't want it that thick. It's awesome that I can get it that thick, but I definitely want it smaller. So I'm going to double click this. I'm going to go down to size. Now I'm going to go down to like 4. And then I'm going to click OK. Now this looks like it's more up my alley in terms of how I would like to draw and or convey things. So you would start out, and you'll notice that the lighter you press, the lighter the line, right? And then you can just keep doing that. It's just like you're inking with an actual pen. Press more pressure, the more you'll actually get, and you'll notice that this is what it starts to look like. Now this is very different than this type of inking, which is very straightforward. It doesn't have as much of that organic feel when you're doing it with the pen tool, but you have to do a lot of manipulation with the pen tool to get it to feel like the brush tool does. Now that's not to say that the brush tool is better, because again, I prefer the pen tool, but I just choose to manipulate it in a way that fits my art style. The brush tool, however, if you are looking for that organic means, you can do that. And a good thing about it is you'll notice that when you're using the brush tool, Blob Brush, let me be very specific. Right now we're talking about the Blob Brush. that you can do on the fly weight adjustments depending upon the settings that you pick. The only problem is if you're not accustomed to using it, it may be aggravating getting used to using fills. I like to use strokes when I'm creating my art and my line work, actually. And that makes it easier for me. Not that it's better. Again, you can use either or. It just depends what suits you. And you can go back in, like for instance, right here. This section just looks a little sloppy because it's not really connected. You can always go back in with your brush tool and you can just compensate for whatever it was you missed out on and make sure it connects in with the other line. And you just keep doing that until you get it correct. And then you use stuff like the eraser tool, which will then allow you to erase those parts off of your line so that way it looks more consistent. And the eraser tool you can find in your panel looks like an eraser, and it's actually right next to the Blob Brush tool, and then you would use that to actually clean up your line work. So it's very, very simple. And you can go through it relatively quickly. Say we go like this. If you're really fast with it, it's nothing for you to create your artwork and get it as accurately as possible to what you're trying to do. All right, so you have these as options. This is one way that you can actually create your artwork using that. Now, the other way we're going to show you is to create with the pencil tool. Now, the pencil tool is very similar in terms of the options that you use for the accuracy, just like you did with the actual Blob Brush tool. The only difference, though, is that it doesn't give you all of those parameters for size, and that's because the pencil tool functions like the pen tool, except it's organic. It doesn't work on curves. It works on how you're actually drawing the line itself. All right, and let's see. You can start drawing out, pretend like it's an actual pencil, and you'll see how the lines are actually turning out in terms of the level of accuracy. And you can always change that, like we said before. And you can draw this just like the pen tool as a stroke or a fill, but I prefer to do it with a stroke because it allows you to see the artwork behind your actual stroke itself. So make sure you're very wary of that. And when you select it, you can do just the same things that you did with the pen tool. Change the stroke size, you can change the cap type, and you can also change the projection, and you can change the actual profile of it. Same thing that you could do with the pen tool, you could do with the pencil tool, but the pencil tool is faster. And the reason I say it's faster is because you're drawing with hand with a pencil tool. The only problem is because of the way it's set up, the pencil tool will not draw precisely how you want it unless you go all the way to the accurate portion of it, and then even then it may not draw it exactly how you want it, which is where the actual pen tool comes in, because you can make sure that you get every intricate little minute small detail that is possible using the pen tool. Now if you want to get every detail using the pencil tool, and this is Adobe Illustrator CC, so the pencil tool functions a little differently in this version, but even if you were using it in other versions, you can change the fidelity and smoothness in the other version so that you can get it precisely where you want it to be, and it will follow your hand movement exactly. The only problem with that was a lot of people were aggravated with the number of anchor points that you were getting because it was difficult to manipulate, but that is the trade-off on accuracy. It has to have a lot of anchor points. Less anchor points can be accurate only if you have smooth curves, but if you don't, then you're going to run into tons of anchor points. Now, if you want to get the new pencil tool to work as accurate as the old one, a trick that I learned is that while you're creating it, and I'll show you this, like let's say we want to get this line as accurate as possible using the pencil tool. I'm going to go and I'm going to be as intricate as possible. Accuracy is all the way up. And I'm going to go around each edge, and we're going to stop right about here. All right. Now, if you look, you'll notice it's not exactly as accurate as I wanted it. It's close, but not exactly as accurate. Now, one of the things you can do is when you're using the actual pen tool, you'll notice that the more anchor points you create, the more the accuracy. So essentially, to do what you do with the pen tool, with the pencil tool, you have to make it function like the pen tool. And you just got to create more anchor points. How to create those anchor points on the fly on your own is the new tool allows you to hit the Alt key and create straight lines. And it has to drop an anchor point wherever you ended. So what I like to do is while I'm creating it, I will constantly hit the Alt or Option key on the keyboard as I'm creating it, and it will create a ton of anchor points. And because it's doing that, it will have to accurately depict my line. You can also stop it at a point and keep going, and it'll give you your line as accurate as possible. But when you're clicking those little anchor points, it's giving you a ton of accurate anchor points. Now you just are going to have to manipulate those later if you so decide to, and that's up to you. But essentially, we're going to go through our whole piece, create our artwork with the line work that we want, and then when we're done with that, we're going to work on coloring, inking, in terms of the shading aspect, and then the highlighting in terms of the remainder of the piece. These are going to be the 3 sections that we're going to cover afterwards. So make sure that you create your line work, you set it up how you want, and then in our next section, we're going to cover dealing with coloring in your actual illustration. Okay? So I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Thanks for joining me thus far, and I'll talk with you later.